It's in the dead of night, beneath the flickering fluorescent lights of a New York hospital. A desperate black mother-to-be stumbles in, clutching her belly and her last shred of hope. But little does she know, the very place meant to save lives would become her grave, just because of the color of her skin. This isn't just a story of tragedy. It's a tale of justice served, decades in the making. Watch how the wheels of fate turn in the most unexpected way. Watch how the life of a black pregnant woman is cruelly denied by a racist doctor, only for fate to take an extraordinary turn decades later. A mysterious man arrives at the very same hospital and declares, "You denied that woman's right to live, but today I deny you the right to work in the very hospital you tried to use against her." Who is this man? What is his connection to the tragedy of that night? Stay tuned to uncover this gripping story of injustice, karma, and redemption. It was a cold, quiet night in New York City. The streets outside the hospital were dimly lit, the occasional hum of passing cars punctuating the stillness. Inside, the hospital was stark and sterile, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh, pale glow over white-tiled walls. The halls, though clean, felt devoid of warmth. The faint sound of monitors beeping and footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor filled the air. But there was an eerie silence that seemed to linger. Melissa stumbled through the hospital's glass doors, clutching her swollen belly. Her face was pale with exhaustion, beads of sweat rolling down her temples despite the chill outside. She was wearing a faded coat, the edges fraying from years of use. Her breathing was labored, every step more difficult than the last. A hotel waitress by day and night, she had just finished a grueling double shift, cleaning tables and serving patrons who rarely even noticed her. This night was supposed to bring her joy, the night her baby would finally arrive, but her body was failing her. She approached the reception desk, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Please, I need help. My baby is coming." The receptionist hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously at Dr. Rob, who was standing near the hallway. Dr. Rob was a tall, middle-aged man with a clean-shaven face and sharp features. His white coat was immaculate, his posture straight, but there was an air of arrogance in the way he carried himself. He looked over at Melissa, his piercing eyes cold and unfeeling. Without moving closer, he barked at the receptionist. "Triage is full. Check her insurance before anything else." The receptionist, clearly uneasy, fumbled with her words. "But, doctor, she looks like she's in active labor." Dr. Rob didn't even glance in Melissa's direction. "We're not a charity. Let her wait. These people always exaggerate." Melissa heard the words and felt her heart sink. She clutched the edge of the counter to steady herself, her knees threatening to give out, but she wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of him. She had learned long ago that tears wouldn't soften men like Rob. Instead, she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, I've worked so hard for this moment. My baby needs help." Rob sighed, finally stepping closer, but his expression remained disdainful. He glanced at her, barely hiding his contempt. "Did you even bother to make an appointment? Of course not," he muttered under his breath. Melissa didn't respond, too overwhelmed to process his words. Rob turned on his heel and walked away, signaling to the staff that he wouldn't be involved. Melissa's mind raced as she struggled to understand what was happening. She thought of the long hours she had worked to save money for this moment. Her dream was simple, just a safe delivery and a chance to hold her baby in her arms. She had faced countless hardships, endured humiliation, and fought against the odds, all for the life she carried within her. She looked down at her belly, whispering softly, "Just hold on, baby. Mommy's here." In another corner of the hospital, Dr. Rob was speaking to a nurse, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do you think these people ever learn? They waltz in here expecting first-class treatment and don't even bother with the basics." The nurse, a young black woman, clenched her jaw but said nothing. She had seen this side of Rob too many times and knew better than to challenge him. Rob waved dismissively and walked down the hall, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. As he passed by another patient, a black man in his 60s, he ignored the man's outstretched hand, brushing past him as if he didn't exist. The man called out weakly, but Rob didn't even glance back. To him, they were all the same, beneath his attention. Back in the waiting area, Melissa was trying to remain calm, her hand resting protectively over her belly. She thought about the life she wanted for her child, a life far removed from the struggles she had known. She had grown up in a small town, working from a young age to support her family. She had always been told that New York was the land of opportunity, a place where dreams came true. But standing here now, ignored and dismissed, she felt the weight of her reality pressing down on her. Her legs buckled and she sank into a chair, her breathing uneven. She looked around the room hoping for a kind face, someone who would help her, but all she saw were blank stares and hurried footsteps. Her vision blurred as tears threatened to spill over. For the first time in years, she felt utterly powerless. Melissa gritted her teeth as another wave of pain surged through her body. She staggered toward the nurse's station, her breath shallow and uneven. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Please, someone help me. My baby is coming." Her hand instinctively rested on her belly, as if trying to shield her unborn child from the harsh reality around her. A nurse glanced at her, her expression filled with concern, but before she could respond, Dr. Rob's voice cut through the air like a knife. "What now?" he said sharply, his tone laced with irritation. He approached the desk, his eyes cold and calculating as they landed on Melissa. She tried to steady herself, standing tall despite the pain. "Doctor, I need help, please." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to speak. "I've been feeling contractions for hours. I think it's time." Dr. Rob crossed his arms, his gaze sweeping over her with disdain. "Do you have an appointment, insurance, or are you just here to cause trouble?" Melissa blinked, stunned by the harshness of his words. She opened her mouth to speak, but he interrupted her. "We don't have space for people like you tonight. Go somewhere else." Her legs wobbled, but she stood firm. "Doctor, I don't have anywhere else to go. Please, my baby." He raised a hand, silencing her. "There's no room, no staff, and frankly, no point in wasting resources on cases like this. I suggest you leave before you cause a scene." Melissa's heart sank, but desperation pushed her forward. She clutched his arm, tears streaming down her face. "I'm begging you, my baby's life is at stake." Dr. Rob pulled away, a look of disgust crossing his face. "Don't touch me," he snapped. "You people think you can just walk in here and demand things. I said no." The staff nearby exchanged uneasy glances. A young nurse stepped forward hesitantly. "Doctor, maybe we should—" Rob turned to her with a glare. "Unless you want to be unemployed tomorrow, you'll stay out of this." The nurse froze, her face pale, and stepped back reluctantly. Melissa's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, clutching her belly as pain shot through her body. She cried out, her voice echoing down the sterile hallway. "Please, someone help me. My baby, my baby." A faint murmur spread among the staff. Some whispered about calling for backup, but none dared to defy Rob. He stood there, arms crossed, watching with a detached expression. "If she doesn't leave, call security," he muttered under his breath. As Melissa writhed in pain on the cold floor, her mind raced through fragmented memories. She saw herself as a young girl, holding her mother's hand as they walked through a bustling marketplace. Her mother's voice echoed in her ears. "You're strong, Melissa. You can survive anything." The image shifted to her tiny apartment, where she had lovingly painted the walls with bright colors for her baby's arrival. She had so many dreams for this child, a life free from the struggles she had endured. A sharp contraction jolted her back to reality. She screamed, the sound raw and heart-wrenching. The young nurse couldn't bear it any longer. She knelt beside Melissa, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Hold on, I'll do what I can," she whispered. But Rob was already storming over. "What are you doing? I said no one treats her." The nurse stood her ground, tears in her eyes. "She's dying, doctor. You can't just—" "Yes, I can," he snapped. "And if you value your career, you'll stop this nonsense." Melissa's breathing grew shallow. She tried to speak but couldn't form the words. Her vision blurred, and the world around her seemed to fade. The nurse hesitated, torn between duty and fear. In her final moments of consciousness, Melissa felt a sudden, sharp pain. Then, a strange calm washed over her. She whispered, barely audible, "Baby, stay strong, for me." The young nurse acted quickly, despite Rob's threats. She called for an emergency kit and worked frantically to deliver the baby. Melissa's body was weak, her pulse fading, but she held on just long enough to hear the faint cry of her newborn. A small, fragile life now lay in the nurse's arms. Tears streamed down Melissa's face as she tried to smile. She reached out weakly, her fingers brushing the baby's blanket. "You'll be okay?" she whispered. Her hand fell limp and the room fell silent. The nurse cradled the baby, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. She looked at Dr. Rob, who stood unmoved, his expression a mask of indifference. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "One day you'll pay for what you've done." Rob scoffed and walked away, leaving the nurse to clean up the aftermath of his cruelty. The hospital wasted no time in masking the truth. Within hours of Melissa's death, an official report was drafted, cold and clinical. The cause of death was listed as unfortunate complications during labor. No mention was made of the negligence or the refusal of care. Staff were warned to remain silent, their jobs hanging in the balance. The institution had a reputation to uphold, and Melissa's tragedy was just another inconvenient statistic to bury. Dr. Rob signed the report with the same detachment he showed during her final moments. To him, it was just another night, another patient who hadn't fit the mold. He continued his rounds the next morning, walking through the halls with his usual arrogance, oblivious to the whispers among the staff. Some avoided his gaze, their guilt weighing heavy, while others silently vowed never to forget what they had witnessed. In a quiet corner of the hospital, the young nurse who had defied Rob sat cradling Melissa's baby. The child was small but strong, his tiny cries cutting through the stillness of the nursery. The nurse's heart ached as she looked down at him, wondering how such an innocent life could be born into so much pain. She whispered softly, "You're going to be someone great. I'll make sure of it." But her options were limited. With no family to claim the baby and the hospital eager to wash its hands of the situation, the child was placed into the foster care system. The nurse, unable to take him in herself, made a silent promise to keep track of him as best she could. Before handing him over, she slipped a note into the baby's blanket, a small keepsake that read, "Your mother was a fighter. Never forget where you came from." The years that followed were difficult for Melissa's son. Bouncing between foster homes, he learned early on that the world was a harsh place. Yet, even in his darkest moments, he clung to an unshakable sense of purpose. The few stories he managed to piece together about his mother painted a picture of resilience and sacrifice. She had given everything for him, and he vowed to make her proud. By the time he reached his teenage years, he had developed a fierce determination to rise above his circumstances. He excelled in school, driven by a hunger for knowledge and a desire to create a better future. Teachers often remarked on his maturity, noting that he seemed far older than his years. But beneath his composed exterior lay a burning question that haunted him. What had truly happened to his mother? As he grew older, he began to dig into his past. Every foster home had provided fragments of his identity, but the full picture remained elusive. Then, on his 18th birthday, he opened an envelope that had been passed down from the young nurse who had delivered him. Inside was the note she had left all those years ago, along with a single name: Melissa. Holding the note in his hands, he felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: grief for the mother he never knew, anger at the injustice she had suffered, and an unrelenting drive to uncover the truth. He swore that he would honor her memory, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Dr. Rob continued his career unscathed. His colleagues regarded him as a seasoned professional, though some whispered about his icy demeanor and questionable ethics. The events of that night faded into obscurity, buried under layers of bureaucracy and silence. Rob himself seemed unaffected, his conscience shielded by his belief in his own superiority. But time has a way of unraveling even the best-kept secrets. Melissa's son, now a young man with a sharp mind and an unyielding spirit, was determined to find the answers he sought. He had no idea that his journey would lead him back to the very hospital where his life had begun and where his mother's had tragically ended. The hospital had changed dramatically over the past 25 years. Its cold, sterile walls were now replaced with sleek, modern interiors. State-of-the-art technology hummed quietly in the background, and bright, welcoming artwork adorned the walls. The nameplate at the entrance proudly displayed its new title, Hope Healthcare Center. Michael strode through the hospital's double doors, his tailored suit immaculate, exuding an air of confidence and authority. His gaze was sharp, his posture commanding, and as he walked through the bustling lobby, heads turned. Staff whispered among themselves, recognizing him as the hospital's new owner. The visionary entrepreneur whose healthcare chain had become a national success. But Michael wasn't here for admiration. He had waited his entire life for this moment. In his private office, Michael sat at a large oak desk, his fingers running over the edge of a file folder. The name on the cover read, Melissa Carter. He had spent years piecing together his mother's story, and now, with unrestricted access to the hospital's records, he had finally uncovered the full truth. His heart ached as he read the cold, clinical notes documenting her death. Beneath the sanitized language, he saw the unmistakable signs of neglect and cruelty. At the bottom of the report, the signature stood out like a scar: Dr. Robert Hayes. Michael closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a reminder of how far he had come. He thought of his mother, her strength and resilience, and the life she had sacrificed for him. A deep determination settled in his chest. It was time to make things right. He picked up the phone and spoke calmly to his assistant. "Bring Dr. Hayes to my office, now." Dr. Rob, now in his late 60s, entered the office with an air of weariness. His once imposing figure had softened, his posture slightly stooped, but the arrogance in his expression remained. He had heard rumors about the hospital's new owner, but had dismissed them as inconsequential. Now, standing face to face with Michael, he felt a flicker of unease. Michael gestured toward a chair opposite his desk. "Please, have a seat, doctor." Rob sat down slowly, studying the man before him. "You wanted to see me? Is this about the budget cuts? Because if so—" Michael raised a hand, silencing him. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that made Rob pause. "This isn't about budgets. It's about accountability." Rob frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "I don't understand." Michael leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Rob's. "Do you remember a patient named Melissa Carter? 25 years ago. She came here in labor late one night. You refused to treat her." Rob's face froze, his mind racing. The name stirred something distant and faint, but he quickly masked his uncertainty with indignation. "I've treated thousands of patients over the years. I can't be expected to remember every—" "You remember her," Michael interrupted, his voice colder now. "She was black, desperate, and in pain. You denied her care because of the color of her skin. She died that night, but not before giving birth to a baby boy." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "That boy was me." Rob's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. For a moment he said nothing, his mind scrambling for a response. Finally he scoffed, forcing a laugh. "This is absurd. You can't possibly—" Michael stood abruptly, towering over him. "Don't lie to me. I've read the files. I've spoken to the people who were there. I know everything." His voice softened, but his eyes burned with intensity. "Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up knowing your mother died because someone like you decided her life didn't matter?" Rob shifted in his seat, his composure unraveling. "I was following protocol. The hospital was understaffed. It wasn't personal." "It was racism," Michael shot back, his words cutting through the room like a blade. "You looked at her and decided she wasn't worth saving. You condemned her and me to a lifetime of pain because you couldn't see past her skin color." The silence that followed was deafening. Rob looked down, his expression unreadable. For the first time, the weight of his actions seemed to press down on him, though whether it was regret or fear of consequences was unclear. Michael didn't wait for an apology. He walked to the door and opened it, revealing a group of staff members standing outside, along with several journalists. Cameras flashed as they stepped into the room, their presence turning the private confrontation into a public reckoning. Michael turned back to Rob. "You don't deserve to practice medicine. You don't deserve to be in a position of trust or power. Effective immediately, you're suspended from this hospital, and I'll make sure your license is revoked." Rob's face paled, his mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came. The cameras captured every moment, his humiliation, Michael's unwavering resolve, and the silent approval of the staff, who had long resented Rob's behavior. Michael stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just for my mother. This is for every person you've ever mistreated, every life you've ever devalued. You will never hurt anyone again." Rob stood shakily, his shoulders slumped. He walked out of the office under the scrutiny of the crowd, his once imposing presence reduced to a shadow of its former self. The door closed behind him, leaving Michael alone with the weight of what he had just done. As the crowd dispersed, Michael returned to his desk, his gaze falling on the file once more. He picked it up and walked down the hallway to a plaque near the hospital's new maternity wing. The words etched into the metal read, "Melissa's Memorial Maternity Wing, dedicated to the strength and sacrifice of mothers everywhere." He placed the file beneath the plaque and stood there for a moment, his heart heavy, but his resolve unshaken. A nurse passed by and stopped, recognizing him. She smiled softly and said, "Your mother would be proud." Michael nodded, his voice barely above a whisper, "I hope so." The hallway was eerily quiet, yet it felt heavy with history. Michael stood motionless, his hands in his pockets, staring at the spot where his mother had collapsed 25 years ago. The linoleum tiles were long replaced, and the walls now bore vibrant murals of mothers holding their children. Yet in his mind, he could still see her, Melissa, clutching her belly, crying out for help that never came. He closed his eyes, letting the memories of the stories he had pieced together wash over him. He imagined her strength, her desperation, and her final moments of courage as she brought him into the world. A deep sadness filled his chest, but it was tempered by a quiet pride. He was here. He had survived. And he had made sure her death was not in vain. A soft voice broke his thoughts. "She'd be so proud of you." Michael turned to see an elderly nurse standing nearby. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she offered him a kind smile. "Your mother's story has been with me all these years. I've always prayed someone would give her the justice she deserved." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said softly. The nurse gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before walking away, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. He looked up at the plaque on the wall, its gleaming surface reflecting the dim hallway lights. It read, "Melissa's Memorial Maternity Wing is dedicated to the strength and sacrifice of mothers everywhere." This was his way of ensuring no woman would ever face what his mother had endured. The wing was equipped with cutting-edge technology and a staff trained not only in medical care, but in empathy and understanding. It was a place of healing, a sanctuary for those who needed it most. Michael placed a hand on the plaque, his fingers tracing the letters of her name. "I hope this is enough, Mom," he whispered. "I hope this makes it right." In another part of the hospital, Dr. Rob sat in his office, his head bowed as he packed his belongings into a worn cardboard box. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on him. The humiliation, the loss of his career, and the realization that his past had finally caught up to him left him hollow. The room felt colder now, the walls closing in as he placed the last of his files into the box. The door opened, and Michael stepped inside, his presence filling the room. Rob didn't look up, but he could feel the intensity of Michael's gaze. "It's done," Michael said simply. "You're no longer part of this hospital." Rob finally looked up, his expression a mix of anger and defeat. "You think this makes you better than me? You think you've won?" Michael's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about winning. It's about justice, something you denied my mother and so many others." Rob smirked bitterly. "Justice, a pretty word. It doesn't change the past." "No, it doesn't," Michael replied firmly. "But it ensures the future is different. People like you will no longer have the power to harm others. That's what matters." Rob said nothing, his eyes dropping back to the box in his lap. He rose slowly, the weight of his defeat evident in his posture. As he walked past Michael, his steps faltered. For a moment, it seemed he might say something, But instead, he continued out the door, his figure shrinking as he disappeared down the hallway. Michael watched him leave, his face impassive. He turned back to the office, now empty and silent, and took a deep breath. Walking over to the desk, he placed a framed photo of Melissa on it, a picture he had found in her belongings years ago. She was smiling in the photo, her eyes full of hope. As he turned to leave, he glanced at the maternity wing one last time. His voice was steady, filled with both sorrow and determination, as he spoke to no one in particular. Justice isn't just about the past. It's about creating a world where no one has to fight for it again. With those words, Michael stepped into the hallway, the sound of his footsteps fading as he moved forward toward a future his mother had always dreamed of, but never lived to see.